Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, Executive Editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with the Haydn Symphony Crusade, and we're up to Symphony number 29. Now, Symphony number 29 was written in 1765. It's smack dab in the middle of the first batch of Haydn symphonies for his new patron, Prince Esterhazy. And it's in the key of E major, which is a very unusual key for Haydn. He only uses it in two symphonies. In fact, it's an unusual key for symphonies generally. It may interest you to know, because we just did a talk about it rather recently, about symphonies in the key of C-sharp minor. C-sharp minor is the relative minor of E major, and C-sharp minor is also unusual. Both keys have the same key signature. That is, they use four sharps. And E has this, relates to C-sharp minor. Relative majors and minors, all you need to know about them is that they have the same scale. And depending on where you start that scale, you can get either a major scale or a minor scale, because whether something's major and minor depends on the distance between the notes. And those distances are carved up into what we call half steps and whole steps. And if you have a certain number of half steps and whole steps in a row, you get minor key, and otherwise you get major keys. It's really pretty straightforward. So E major is four sharps, and its relative minor is C-sharp minor. And because it has four sharps, it's a little bit tricky to read notationally and a little awkward for certain instruments. And for those reasons, you don't encounter that key particularly often in the symphonic literature. And this is one of the very rare instances where you do. Does that key have any particular meaning? Hang in there, because we're going to be doing a talk about those as part of our Well-Tempered series, which has a playlist now. You can see the first three of them all grouped together, keys and their emotional qualities. So I do urge you to go have a look at that series. It's a lot of fun, and you'll encounter a lot of music you probably haven't heard before. Anyway, this is a lovely lyrical symphony with some very quirky, typically Haydnesque tricks up its sleeve. The first movement has a wonderful, easy, relaxed opening. In fact, the tempo, which is marked in the critical edition Allegro di molto, which means very fast, is marked Allegro ma non troppo, which is quick but not too much, in other sources. And the truth is, the music essentially plays itself. It gives you no choice about what the tempo is supposed to be. There are two principles at work in this movement that I really would like you to pay attention to, because they're very, very interesting, and they will have a great deal of significance as Haydn's style develops. That is the control of movement through the notation. What I mean by that is, you'll hear the very opening is a very lyrical, calm theme. It's a dialogue between the violins and the oboes in long notes. But as the exposition proceeds, these notes get shorter and shorter until at the end you're dealing with very quick triplets. And so the music seems to speed up as it goes. In reality, it hasn't. In reality, the basic tempo is there throughout, but the illusion is one of continuing acceleration. And this is critically important for the sonata style that Haydn evolved in writing his symphonies, and in producing this impression of easy athletic movement that you hear in all of the best orchestral writing of this period, because composers learned how to control pace, how to control the impression of movement, and how to relate that to the underlying change of harmonies, the movement from one key to the next. And by doing that, they create tension and climax and excitement. And this little symphony does it in a very, very graphic way, in both of its outer movements, I might say. They both begin, actually, one of the ways Haydn binds the symphony together is that the first movement and the finale, which you'll hear, start with basically the same idea. One is soft, one is loud, one is a little faster than the other, but it's a theme in long notes, sometimes a unison statement for the strings. But the other the other aspect of this symphony that's very, very interesting and that actually applies to the first three movements, not so much the fourth, is the concept of dialogue. In the first movement, it's the dialogue between the strings and the oboes. And this idea of a dialogue, this exchange of ideas, is breaking up the melody between different orchestral colors. It permeates the entire work. And it's quite wonderful how Haydn does it, because there are many ways to create this kind of alternating dialogue. In the first movement, it's a dialogue of timbre. It's different instruments. We'll talk about the other movements as we get to them. But right now, I want to play you the first movement. It's a very monothematic movement. In other words, we learned that in sonata form, you're supposed to have two ideas, a first subject and a second subject, and then the development, and blah, 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 blah. We talk about that extensively. But for Haydn, that was only one way to go. The other way to go is to base everything on the opening tune and leave it at that. Even though he changes key and looks like he's going to introduce another idea, the new idea is really just based on what we've already heard. And so it's a big, unified opening paragraph. And what's more important than the first subject, second subject, or first theme, second theme sort of duality of sonata form is this idea of dialogue, of strings versus oboes. And you hear that immediately in the development. And I'm going to mark where the development begins so you can just hear how Haydn carries it through the whole movement. And when the recapitulation happens, it's strings with oboes and horns. He's always varying the timbre and varying the actual character of the melody, the answer. But the principle, these colors remain the same as the music evolves. And so that gives a wonderful flexibility and suppleness, I think is the word, to the music of this movement. That and the control of speed, the idea of an acceleration by writing tunes in smaller note values as you go forward. So let me play you the first movement without repeats all the way through, and pay attention to these two things. You don't have to worry about form. The form takes care of itself. Just the idea of speed, the idea of pacing, and the idea of dialogue between strings and oboes, or oboes and horns, woodwinds and strings generally. And that'll give you really all you need to know about it, and you'll enjoy the ride. That was Nicholas Ward with the Northern Chamber Orchestra. And by the way, notice the wonderful absence of an annoying continuo part. The harpsichord, it's great without it. I love it without it. Yes, it's wonderful. You don't need it. It's just irritating. Okay. Now, the second movement. The second movement is one of those typical andantes we find in these symphonies with no other wind parts. It's for strings only, and it's also in sonata form. But again, the idea here is one of dialogue. And the dialogue in this case is between the various string sections. Mostly, the main theme is cut up. It's broken up between the first violins and the second violins. And that may be a little tricky to hear, because you actually don't get the sense of answer and question and answer or call and response unless the violins are separated left and right stereophonically. In performance, of course, you'd be watching it. You'd see they do a little bit, they do a little bit, they do a little bit. But the idea is you can't tell. It sounds like one continuous melody, but it's actually broken up in dialogue between the strings. And then at the very end, the cellos and basses answer as well with their own thing. They have their own little gruff commentary, and it is gruff. It's forte, where the rest of it is piano. And it's really very, very charming. I mean, the idea of these symphonies at this point in Haydn's career is not to be emotionally deep. It's to charm and amuse and entertain, and he did it better than anybody ever has. It is top quality entertainment. That's what we're getting here. And so I'm going to play you a bit of the second movement, and you'll begin to hear as it goes on, I think. You can tell that there are actually two different sections at work in playing this main theme. But again, it's the idea of dialogue, which Haydn is working with throughout this symphony, and in each movement in a slightly different way. So here it is, the slow movement. Now that was just the exposition. I'm not going to give away the rest of the movement. There's no need to. All I'm going to tell you is that one of the wonderful things about the recapitulation, the restatement, is that the order of events is not the same, which means that there is a surprise ending to this movement, and I'm going to leave you to figure out what it is. But it's one of those things that Haydn does, actually not infrequently, but always in a surprising way, always in a way to give you a little bit of a jolt and never let you simply think that you know exactly what's going to happen, and there's no point in continuing to listen. You always have to keep listening when you come to Haydn. For sure, because there's always a little trick up his sleeve or something to justify the repeated attention that you give him. Now, the minuet, I love this minuet. This minuet is fascinating. The basic body of the minuet does indeed contain the idea of dialogue, but here it's a question of dynamics. It's done in terms of loud versus soft, and the soft bits are wonderful because what they do is they trip up the dance rhythm. They change the phrasing. Remember, we had a big talk about minuets and phrasing because a basic minuet is going to be 2 halves in 4 and 8 bar phrases. The idea being so that you know where the dance steps go because it is a dance. Haydn's symphonic minuets almost never do that. They're almost always irregular in some way. And here, the irregularity is in the soft bits. In the first part of the minuet, the first half, the soft bit is only 2 bars long after the normal 4 bars. But what that makes is a 6-bar phrase, which is quite irregular sounding, and that's answered by another one. So another 6-bar phrase, though without the quiet bit. So the whole thing sounds just a bit lopsided, and you don't exactly know, where the rhythm is going to go, which is absolutely wonderful. I love these minuets because so many composers, they write these formulaic, boring minuets, but Haydn was at particular pains at these times where, the music could be just very, very foursquare to try and make sure that it isn't. And remember, I said the first movement, I said it has suppleness. Well, here you have that similar suppleness. And in the second half of the minuet, it gets even crazier because the quiet bit gets quieter and quieter and quieter, and you don't know when it's going to end until all of a sudden the main theme of the minuet comes bursting back in when you least expect it. It's a wonderful surprise, and it goes to show again how Haydn is able to exploit the idea of this dialogue, this idea of an exchange of thoughts or ideas, in this case between loud and soft. He's doing it purely with dynamics, and every movement has its thing. That's what's so wonderful about this symphony. I can't even begin to tell you what a joy it is to listen to these things, because everything that you hear does something new, but at the same time they're all related. They all belong to this one symphony number 29, because this is the symphony where Haydn exhausts or works with this concept to such an extent. So, enough talk. Here is the minuet proper, the basic section of the minuet. Then we're going to do the middle section, the trio, in a minute. Isn't that wonderful? See, what makes Haydn so cool, and I never tire of saying this, is that he creates fantastic ideas out of the basic elements of music. In this case, just loud versus soft. The essentials. He doesn't need to do anything fancy, and he doesn't have to be, self-consciously erudite or overly complex. He simply understands what music is and what it can do and how to work with it for maximum effect. And there you have it at its most basic. What could be more essential than a loud and a soft? But he's using it to such artistic effect to reach such wonderful goals of surprise and amusement for us, the listener. He's such a nice guy. He's so good to us, really. Now, the trio section is actually controversial, the middle section. It is really, really cool. It consists of a horn note, a pedal it's called, because it's a long-held note, and a string accompaniment, a sort of pa waltz accompaniment. And there's no melody. There's no melody at all. In fact, this lack of melody was so surprising that some modern performances, which use the harpsichord, which is the harpsichord continuo, they have someone improvise a tune on top of it because it's clearly an accompaniment to something, but that something is not written at all. Haydn leaves it completely up to your imagination. So you can either simply listen to it for what it is, which sounds quite eerie, actually, because you can tell in a way that something's missing, but on the other hand, the harmonies themselves are so unusual and interesting that it doesn't seem like it needs anything, but it could. and so you can imagine something on top. You can make up your own thing that this is an accompaniment to, or you can simply enjoy it for what it's worth. It is enigmatic. It is a musical enigma. And, to put something like that into a major work, a big orchestral piece particularly, was a very new and striking thing. It's so new and so shocking, for example, that even today people think Haydn must have left something out or something must be wrong, but he didn't. He didn't. That's what's there. There's been speculation that, he conducted from the keyboard, and although sometimes he played the violin, we don't really know, and we don't know that there was a keyboard. But if assuming he conducted from the keyboard, because there would always have been a keyboard at these concerts, because you didn't just play symphonies, you played arias and songs and other things that would have required a keyboard. So there was one there. And Haydn could have conducted the orchestra from it, and they speculate that maybe he improvised a different tune over this accompaniment every time he was there. We have no idea. No idea whatsoever. And of course, if somebody really had a great thing they could put on top of this trio, they could do it if they wanted to. But I just think it's fabulous that Haydn could write something that still excites controversy even today, and which is so sort of radical in its conception that people aren't quite sure what to make of it. Oh yes, absolutely. He's smarter than we are. That's the bottom line, isn't it? So here is the trio section. Just listen to this. It's so cool. So what do you think? Is it just leave it the way it is, or should you throw something on top of that? I don't have an answer. I don't think there is any one right answer. I think it is music of possibility. Okay, so let's get on to the finale. Now, as I said, the finale begins with a unison loud statement, which is audibly related to the opening of the entire symphony. But unlike all of the other movements that are disassembling the orchestra, dealing with dialogue in one way or another, this movement does just the opposite. Everything comes together. In fact, the first and second violins are in unison for just about the entire exposition. In fact, the entire movement, everybody is together. And that's one of the things that makes this finale so fulfilling. The other thing that makes it so much fun is that Haydn actually does take a bit of a trick from the Minuet. And remember, the Minuet was a dialogue between loud and soft. This is not so much a dialogue between loud and soft as it is between repeated motives. After the opening, there really isn't much of a tune. The music consists of patterns, and these patterns are repeated over and over again. Only Haydn never tells you how many times he's going to repeat one of them. There's a wonderful sequence. A sequence is just a repeated motive that goes up or down the scale any number of times. You can do it at different degrees, they're called, of the scale. And this sequence, it goes higher and higher and higher and higher, and it gets repeated 5 times. 5. I mean, 5 is an odd number. Normally, everything in music, as I've told you, comes in multiples of 2, 4, and 8. So a 5-time repeated sequence is really going to trip you up. And then, at the very end of the exposition, there's another sequence, and this one is repeated 6 times. And I'm going to, again, I'll indicate where they are, so you can hear them for yourselves. But what makes it so wonderful is that, when we talked about the control of pace, in the first movement. This is related to that. When you have a repeated motive like this, like these, and they start doing their thing, and you don't know when they're going to stop, the time all of a sudden becomes suspended. Even if the music is moving very quickly, it could be a very fast sequence. If you never know how many times it's going to go and when it's going to quit, you are effectively in suspended animation. And it gives the music just this wonderful feeling of, on the one hand, vivaciousness, because everything's very quick in this movement. It's all moving very zippily. But on the other hand, these moments of all of a sudden, wait, what is this? Where's it going to go? What's it going to do? It's surprise. It's suspense. It creates, in a word, tension. And sonata form and the classical style is all about tension. Tension and release. And I want you to really pay attention to these two sequences and see how they create this tension, this suspense, before the music moves on, and in this case, finally concludes the symphony in a burst of high spirits. So here then is the finale with the two sequences indicated, again without repeats, so that you can get a real sense of what Haydn is doing. It's just so cool and so wonderfully simple. There's nothing like it. There's just nothing like it in all of music. I'm not kidding you. Here you go. And that's it, my friends. Symphony number 29. Another symphony that nobody ever plays, gets no attention. It's such a shame. I should call this the shame crusade, because after every talk I keep saying, oh God, isn't it a shame? Eventually we'll get to symphonies that people do play, and it won't be a shame. But boy, these early ones have so much to offer us, and particularly so much to tell us about the essence, the basic building blocks of music, and what you can achieve with them. That's what Haydn is telling us, and no one else does it more amusingly and more cogently and with more simple joy in working with his materials. So keep on listening, folks. Thank you for joining me. Take care.